didn't manage to start the presentation right in time. But anyway, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining my session today. My name is Mohamed Wali. I work as a solutions architect for AWS Solutions Architecture team based out of Amsterdam, the Netherlands, mainly acting as a technical advisor for enterprise and retail customers within Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg, helping them in their cloud journey towards AWS. Over the past 16 years, AWS customers have expressed appreciation for the detailed information available through the AWS blog posts, tutorials, service documentation, summits, and even conferences. However, we were informed multiple times about the fact that it would be really nice to get some sort of a holistic view, to get some sort of a bigger picture about the AWS security services and how they work together, instead of just having different pieces covered independently apart from each other. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to introduce you to the AWS Security Reference Architecture, which I'm going to abbreviate as AWS SRA, and how it can really help you to achieve that in your environment. But before getting started, I'm quite curious to know if any of you is already familiar with AWS Security Services. So please raise your hand if you have worked with at least one AWS Security Service before. OK, that's kind of 80% of the attendees. Please keep raising your hand if you have worked with 3 or more security services on AWS. That's less than half. Please keep raising your hand if you have worked with 5 or more security services. Well, we're getting few. 10 or more? All right, that's OK, and that's the purpose of this session. Before getting started, I have a confession to make. This session is going to be a level 200 session. So I'm just going to talk about a high-level overview of the solution and how can it really help you to achieve your security objectives. By the end of the day, this solution is quite big enough to have a 2-hour session to really walk through it. So what we're going to talk about today, first of all, start by introducing the AWS SRA, what it is, how it can help you, and why it should matter to you. Then I'll be moving to talk about some of the highlights of the solution. By the end of the day, I will not have enough time to really go through every single piece of the solution. So I'm just going to go through the highlights of the architecture and the core services of it. And by the end of the session, we'll have some time to walk through the documentation being used for the solution and the GitHub repository on which we have published the code that you can use in order to implement this solution. So what is AWS SRA, or Security Reference Architecture? It's simply a set of holistic guidance or guidelines for the full complement of AWS security services. It's actually meant to help you to build pretty much all of these security services on a multi-account environment. So this can be quite helpful, actually, when it comes to managing, designing, and implementing AWS security services that are aligned with the recommended practices. These kind of recommendations are built around a single-page architecture, which you can see on the right side over here. That's where we have pretty much all of the core security services that you can use in order to secure your environment. These kind of services can actually help you to be able to understand what kind of services you need to have in place in order to achieve your security in your environment, in which environment or which accounts you need to provision these accounts, and how they can actually work together. Besides this architecture, you can see that we have some accompanying recommendations available in the documentation, which lists down pretty much all of the details about this solution and how it can really help you in order to implement or improve your security posture. On top of that, we do also have the AWS SRA published on GitHub repo, so you really don't have to reinvent the wheel yourself, and instead you can just go ahead and utilize what we already offered to you, so you can just bootstrap your environment right away. So why would you build, or what did you build a security reference architecture? As I mentioned earlier, we have been informed by customers that they really would like and they are really interested into getting the bigger picture of security on AWS, how they can implement these kind of services. So the 3 common questions we used to hear is, how can I really get this kind of whole view across the whole AWS security environment for my AWS environment? And that actually can be a bit tricky because it's covering different perspectives. So think about identity, think about logging, think about pretty much all of these security-related monitoring stuff. How can I bring them together? The second question is actually about where can I provision and deploy and manage these services? By the end of the day, in your multi-account environment, you have plenty of accounts. Which accounts should be the right ones to deploy these and manage them accordingly? And last but not least, how they can work together in harmony. By the end of the day, you have plenty of security services that you need to use, how you can make sure that pretty much all of these services are working together properly, helping you to achieve your security requirements eventually. And that's actually where the points behind starting this whole solution initially. So how can the AWS SRA help you in your journey? So it can actually help you depending on where you are on your cloud journey. So it can help you to define your own security architecture. Well, it really doesn't matter where you are in your cloud journey in this case, because if you are already at the beginning, that's all right, because you can count on it, making sure that you are aligning with the AWS recommendations. But also if you already have your own established AWS environment that you're trying to enhance its security part, you still count on it to start your security foundations, making sure, for example, your multi-account structure is done properly, your security services are being configured in the right place, and so on. But what if you already have your own security architecture? How can you actually conduct it further? So one other point that the SRA can help you with is to really be able to compare what you do have in place when it comes to your own security architecture against the AWS SRA. And if it matches or aligns with what you are already doing in your environment, that's good. Nothing else needs to be done. But if it doesn't align or mismatch with some of the core security services or the core security principles we're talking about, you can actually have some time to revise the decision taken for that. Because by the end of the day, by revising the decision, you might find that although it deviates from what the SRA recommends, but there could have been a legitimate business reason behind it, which is all right, because by the end of the day, every single organization has its own organizational policies. So you can count on that from that perspective, but at least when revising the decision, you can gain more information about, is it really the right decision you have to take, or could it be enhanced? I know it's a bit challenging as well when it comes to having security architectures and looking at the amount of time you need to invest and the effort you need to invest in order to implement it. Well, with SRA, you really don't have to do it because it's already available for most of the core services that you can deploy and manage via the GitHub repo that I just mentioned earlier. So you can bootstrap your environment right away in a fast and reliable manner without having to really invest a lot of time and effort to get it bootstrapped. In the meanwhile, while you're working on your SRA process, you can actually learn more about the AWS security services. This solution covers tons of AWS security services and how they can work and collaborate together on different layers. So while working throughout the process, you can get to know more about the depths and breadths of AWS security services and how they can work together, and some sort of considerations that you need to watch out for while integrating two or more services together. Besides that, you can actually be able to drive a discussion in your organization to define the security responsibilities. So now when you decide, for example, to implement the AWS SRA, you need to ask some questions. You need to conduct some discussions, asking about, like, is it going to be a centralized security account that have pretty much all of the account? If so, who is the security team, or who are the key stakeholders that are going to manage this account? Or when it comes to monitoring and alerting for your security incidents, is it going to be the application teams themselves, or is it going to be another security team? So pretty much all of these discussions can help you to get to know more about the security responsibilities in your organization, besides also being able to define these kind of gaps if it has not been already defined by your organization. So with that, what I have just talked about so far, I just introduced the AWS SRA, why it's quite important, and how it can really help you in your journey. So let's look or dive a bit deeper into the architecture of the solution. The AWS SRA aligns with three security foundations. One of them is the AWS Cloud Adoption Framework, which is simply a framework that was made by the AWS Professional Services team to help the enterprises and the businesses to transform their business to the cloud and accelerate their business value realization while working on the cloud. The Cloud Adoption Framework is actually built around 6 perspectives. One of these perspectives is security, and that's what the SRA aligns with. By aligning with the security perspectives, it tries to make sure whatever we are trying to do in this architecture is really aligning by implementing the right controls and the right mechanisms to achieve your business and regulatory requirements. It also aligns with the AWS well-architected framework, which is simply a set of best practices that we managed to define after thousands of architecture reviews we have done, either internally or also with our customers. And over the time, we managed to get an idea about what really works out and what doesn't work out. And that's how we came up with the AWS well-architected framework. So this well-architected framework also is built around 6 pillars. One of these pillars is about security, and that's what the AWS SRA aligns with. It makes sure that the architecture that's being built here is really meant to help you to protect your data, your systems, your assets in a more efficient way. And of course, last but not least, it aligns with the shared responsibility model. Security is a top priority at AWS. And when it comes to having or deploying your resources, it's a joint journey. It's not one or the other. So when it comes to EC2 instances, for example, we do take the responsibility of securing the whole stack from the host operating system down to the security of the facilities. But on the other side, you need to invest some effort into making sure that your EC2 instance is having its access restricted, or you are just granting the access to the right people and so on. But it's a joint journey, as I just mentioned, and that's why we also provide the decent documentation and the right tools that can help you to achieve that part of yours. So with that, let's have a high-level overview of the AWS SRA. As you see here, we have on the right side, we have a broad range of accounts and OUs going on here. So on the top side of the diagram, you can see the AWS organization, which is going to be pretty much your own organization. Within this organization, AWS SRA creates 3 OUs: the security OU, the workloads OU, and the infrastructure OU. Within these OUs, there are specific accounts that do specific tasks, which I'm going to cover later on. Beside that, there is this kind of guidance that you do have about AWS organizations for multi-accounts, which is available on AWS websites. It's meant to help you to organize your organizational units, organize your accounts by following the right and best practices. Beside that, there is another document about the multi-account strategy, which dives deeper more onto how you can really, or what kind of accounts you need to create, what kind of OUs you need to create in order to manage your organization properly. These were the kind of things we counted on and we adopted in order to build the AWS SRA. So with that, let's dive a little deeper into the SRA architecture itself. As you say, this is kind of a little hard to read. It's tons of services, it's tons of accounts and OUs. So let's start by account and see what kind of services it has and what is the purpose behind it. So let's start by the security tooling account, which is one of the accounts that would be provisioned as part of the security OU. This account is meant to operate your security services, monitor your AWS accounts, while also being able to automate the security incidents and their responses. So as you see here in this account, for example, we have a bunch of security services. Let's start by an example by talking about the AWS Security Hub, which is actually meant to help you to automate your checks against security standards. Security Hub here actually can go beyond and get or pull in some findings from other security services in this account. So it can get some findings from Amazon Macy, which is meant to get pretty much any findings when it comes to storing sensitive data in Amazon S3. The same for Amazon Guard Duty, which can get findings about threat on your account or any malicious activities going on your account. The same applies to Amazon AWS Firewall Manager as well, which can help you to get to know if there is any resources which is not protected by AWS Shield or AWS WAF and so on. And by the end of the day, all of these findings are being stored here in AWS Security Hub. But what if I would like to get a deeper insight about the root cause of this security finding so I can really be able to address it? For that, you can use Amazon Detective, which can help you to visualize your security issue and be able to track it down to get to know the root cause so you can address and fix it. Eventually, pretty much all of these findings can be stored as well in AWS Audit Manager, which can actually help you to eventually create an assessment audit report so you can get to know how many security findings you have and what is their severity. The other account we have in the security OU is a log archive account, and it's a dedicated account for storing security-related logs and backups. So as you see here, we do have the central logs stored in an Amazon S3 bucket. By storing all of these security-related logs in the S3 bucket, you can actually get to see all of these logs in a single place, while also being able to put the right controls on this S3 bucket to make sure only the right people are able to reach out to this bucket, which contains these kind of security logs. In the meantime, you can also create some monitoring over the bucket, make sure, for example, there is no IAM policy changes, there is no unauthorized access, and so on. And it's getting pretty much all of its logs, as you see here, from the other AWS security services we have been talking about in the previous account. However, if you do have your own applications that's going to generate their own security logs as well, you still can use pretty much the same account. You can create another S3 bucket if you'd like, or depending on how you would like to structure your security logs. and push all of your logs to this account. So you do have a central place for storing all of your security logs eventually. And with that, we can move to the shared service account, which is one of the accounts in the infrastructure OU. This account is simply meant to store the shared security services that can be consumed by the other application, consumed by the other accounts. Think about a service such as Active Directory. Many teams and many applications can be dependent on Active Directory. In this case, you can actually use the shared service account in order to run and operate your AWS directory service. And we do have another OU, which is a workloads OU. Within this OU, you can have your application account. And as you see, there are plenty of services going on here and there. But this is actually how your application account would look like eventually. You have your own applications, but you have plenty of other services as well that's trying to help it to be more secure. So what we did in this example here is we just have a teeny tiny application, a 3-tier web application, running on top of EC2 instances and using Amazon Aurora as its database, and of course being exposed via an application load balancer. You would be interested to make sure, for example, that the data of this application are encrypted. And for that, you can use a service such as AWS KMS, which can help you to encrypt your resources. You can encrypt the ABS volumes associated with the EC2 instances. You can encrypt the databases for the Amazon Aurora. And even when it comes to secret management, your application would, you don't want by the end of the day to hardcore your secrets in your applications. For that, you can actually use AWS Secrets Manager. And that's actually going to help you to store your secrets, which could be another API token for another API that the application needs to communicate with, or the database password that the application needs to communicate with, and so on. So there are plenty of other services that can help you to achieve that, but that's the idea of how we are layering, actually, all of these accounts. So for this example, I'm just going to proceed and see how we can establish more layers on the account level. As you see, we do have 3 boxes. I'm going to start from the left side, which is where we are having the AWS Systems Manager agent. This is mainly meant to help you to manage your EC2 instances. But when we look at it from a security perspective, what can we actually do with AWS Systems Manager agent? So we can actually update our EC2 instances to make sure that they are not exposed to any vulnerabilities. In the meantime, we can use it also to establish a secure connection to the EC2 instances using AWS Session Manager. So you really don't have to expose your EC2 instances via SSH, for example. So you can actually close pretty much all of the ports if not needed and just access it right away via AWS Session Manager. If we move to the next box, we can see multiple endpoints, actually. And these endpoints are meant for different AWS services that this application might need to communicate with. So the purpose of the VPC endpoint is simply to grant you some sort of an access via the backbone network of AWS right to the security you need to interact or authenticate. So you don't have to go through the public internet. You don't need to establish a VPN connection. You don't need to use an AWS Transit Gateway when you count on these endpoints. And going to the left side or the right side, you can see that we have some security services which we have actually seen already on the AWS security tooling account, right? These security services can also be implemented on the application or on the account level as well. So what we have seen initially is actually organization-wide. So we are getting pretty much all of the findings when it comes to AWS Security Hub, AWS Config, and so on from pretty much the whole organization. But what we are getting and seeing here is only on the account level. So your application teams as well can get the visibility for their security findings so they can deal with it as well. So I just would like to pause and review what we have covered so far. We have just talked about the different OUs that form the AWS SRA when it comes to really implementing it, and the different accounts within these OUs and how it can really help you in your security journey. What I'm going to do next is to really talk about security at the different layers. By the end of the day, we don't want to have one security service or one layer for protecting our environment. We don't want to protect our service just on the perimeter. We'd like to defend on depth, making sure that we have as many layers as we can to make it harder to really reach our resources. And that's what I'm going to dive into a little bit deeper. So these are the kind of your AWS environment layers. It actually starts with your AWS organization and your organizational unit. That's your very first layer. Under this layer, there is another layer for your AWS account itself. Within this AWS account, it has its own networking, which you still need to protect as well. And after you are done with that, you need to make sure that the AWS principles, which are the IAM users, the IAM rules, and so on, are also quite restricted down, which is the AWS principles. down all the way to the AWS resources, which are what we are trying to protect eventually. We are trying to do all of that to make sure it's as hard as possible to reach the AWS resources. Yet, we need to also make establish some security rules on top of these resources to make sure that they are well protected. So let's start with the first layer, which is AWS organizations and organization unit. I think you have already seen in the security tooling account, we have plenty of AWS security services where we are centralizing them into a single account. And these kind of services you can use on the OU levels. Besides, you can also use other services such as security control policies, which can actually restrict the access to your accounts, or OUs in general. So you can actually make sure that only the right access is needed, is allowed. Otherwise, it would be prevented by default. There are plenty of other services which can help you to establish your organization protection at this level as well, such as the AWS CloudTrail, which can help you to create an organization-wide CloudTrail log, getting pretty much all of the API events from the different accounts you have across your whole organization. So this is the first layer. The second layer is actually about the accounts themselves, which is a bit similar to what we have, or overlaps to some extent with what we have just covered. So on the account level, you can actually use CloudTrail as well to make sure that the account is, you can track pretty much all of the API events for all of the services while working with them. You can use AWS Secrets Manager and KMS, as we have just seen on the application account level in the previous examples. And pretty much all of the different services that can help you to really restrict down the access to this account as well. Moving into the network layer, where you really need to make sure that from a networking perspective, you're restricting access. Earlier on, we talked about the VPC endpoints, right? These VPC endpoints is going to provide you some good way to communicate and reach out to your AWS security services without having to go via the public internet. But you can also use other services to protect your network. So on the same VPC endpoint, you can actually establish some policies which can restrict the access to the right people or the right services that needs to authenticate it or communicate with it. You can even use security groups on the VPC endpoints to make sure that you're restricting the access to the right resources and maybe the right side of blocks as well. You can use AWS Shield to prevent your resources in your network against DDoS attack. You can use plenty of other AWS security services to help you achieve what you're looking for on a network level or a network layer. And that takes us to the principles, which, as I mentioned earlier, are your IAM identities, which could be an AWS user or an AWS rule. So you can restrict down the access on the principal level by making sure you're granting the least privilege to your users as well. You need to make sure that these users, when they are going to assume rule, that the rule is quite restricted. And even if it's restricted, you need to still make sure that for the session policy assigned to this rule, it's even have more restrictions. You can use permission boundaries to make sure that even if this user managed to assume a certain rule which have a permissive permissions, they can still have some sort of a boundary that contains it, which they cannot go beyond of it. So pretty much all of these services can help you as well to protect your AWS principles. And last but not least, the resources themselves. So you need to make sure that your resources are well protected by using the right services. This could be encrypting the resource itself by using AWS KMS, as I mentioned earlier. Or it could be by setting an IAM-based or a resource-based policy. For example, when we talk about S3 buckets, we can actually assign policies to restrict the access, making sure, for example, that the S3 bucket is only communicated with if the traffic or the communication is encrypted. So pretty much all of these things can really help you to restrict or protect your resources more and more. And that actually leaves us with the last piece of the presentation, which is the AWS SRA code repository. So I've been talking about the SRA, its architecture, its components. How can I really deploy it? As I mentioned earlier, we have already published multiple examples for how you can deploy multiple solutions of what we have discussed so far in GitHub. And these are just some examples of what we have just published. So you don't have to go ahead and do the CloudTrail part yourself. You have a dedicated solution that can do that for you. The same applies for multiple other solutions, such as GuardDuty, Config, Firewall Manager, Macie, and so on. And even for some default account configurations. For example, you want to make sure that any S3 bucket you have is blocking the access by default, unless you are going ahead and modifying that. And in case you're really doing that, you need to have a valid reason in order to do that. The same for encrypting your EBS volumes of EC2 instances. This solution also provides you something like that, so you don't really have to worry about spinning up EC2 instances with non-encrypted EC2 instances. This is how the public GitHub repository looks like, a typical GitHub repo. It's quite a self-service. It's well maintained by AWS mini ProServe team and with some support from the solutions architect as well. The solution is kind of focused on using AWS Control Tower, which we just covered in the previous session. However, you still can use the CloudFormation templates that are mentioned in this GitHub repo to deploy them to multiple accounts using CloudFormation stack sets. So we highly recommend, of course, that you use AWS Control Tower. But if you don't have it, you still can utilize the solution. And by the end of the day, there are pretty much all of this solution is well tested. All of the details are well covered over there. And for that, I can just actually give you an example. This is how the CloudTrail solution looks like. So what we have seen so far is just a high-level design with high-level information. But when you really start working on every single piece of the solution, you get to know more information. You get to know more details about the solution. So for example, over here, this is an architecture diagram of how you can implement CloudTrail across the multiple accounts. And within the documentation of the solution itself, we'd find some descriptions about the deployment and how you can conduct it, and even how you can test it after deploying it. So you make sure that what you have deployed has been deployed successfully according to what we expect. So that's actually pretty much it. This is a QR code for the AWS prescriptive guidance, where you can find the documentation, the detailed documentation that talks about SRA. And this is a code repository where you can find pretty much all of the solutions. Please make sure to scan these QR codes. And that's actually pretty much it. If you do have any questions, I would be more than happy to address.
Any questions?
All right, then thank you for your time.
You.
I wish you a nice day ahead. It was a pleasure to be here, and thanks for joining my session.